Welcome to Leadership Explored, the podcast where we dive into what it means to lead in today's evolving workplace. Every episode, we explore leadership challenges, workplace culture, and the strategies that help professionals navigate an ever-changing world of work. I'm Ed Schaefer, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Andy Siegmund. Today, we're talking about something that comes up a lot in leadership discussions: comparison. Whether it's individuals trying to be the best, companies chasing what top organizations are doing, or leaders trying to emulate what's worked elsewhere, the reality is that comparison can be a double-edged sword. So, Andy, we've both seen this. Organizations that look at Google or Apple or other top companies, and they think they need to do what they're doing. But do they really? So I think we should start there. What do you think drives this almost obsession with benchmarking against the quote-unquote best?
We as people are a species that is built on comparison, right? So status and hierarchy and whatnot is pretty natural to our overall being. And I think that there is some value in having, a proverbial North Star as to, what good looks like or what the best looks like. But in my opinion, at least at the companies where I've seen, these conversations come up, when I start hearing, well, Google does it this way, or Apple or Amazon, or we should be more like a startup, or those sorts of comparisons. What's often lacking is a sense of context as to how and why those organizations are built the way that they are. And not really a strong foundational understanding of whether or not that would work, or if you would even want that to work in your particular organization. I'm curious, Ed, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. There is some innate or inbuilt things that we do around comparison. There's a lot of sports teams and um, just a lot of times we're highlighting the best people who accomplished the most or were the most successful. And I think that is a lot of times that's just the bar that we have to compare against, and not recognizing that those are, that a lot of times the best is like the top 1%. We're talking unlikely to occur again because of certain circumstances and things like that. And I'm always reminded of the quote or the saying, comparison is a thief of joy. And I find that to be true for myself, and almost everybody I know has, when they hear that, they've agreed with it. When anytime you're comparing yourself with someone else or your circumstances against someone else's, it's going to drive insecurity. And I think that applies to organizations as well. As soon as you start comparing against other ones, you lose out on what might make you special. Um, and I think a lot about the idea of, what if I'm a startup, but I'm comparing myself to Google. Um, I'm at the starting line, and they're already, almost to the finish line potentially. And so I'm not really comparing anything that's realistic or that's meaningful or that matters. Um, Also thinking about, when did things when did they start too? There was a lot of opportunity for Google when they started as a search engine, or when AWS was coming in with cloud computing and offering all their services, a lot of opportunity there. But now if we were to try to do the same thing, it'd be really difficult, right? So um, all of those things, I think, just add up to the fact that only one company can be like the best company in the world. Only one company can have the highest revenue in the world or sell the most products in the world. So uh, not everyone can be the best. So as soon as you start always comparing yourself against them, um, what are you doing? You're just limiting yourself, and already seeing there's a restriction there. And I don't know if it's even beneficial really to compare yourself against the best in a lot of circumstances. Maybe if you have huge aspirations and you want to push really hard in a lot of ways and know it's going to take time to get there, you can push. Um, but if where I am in my leadership journey and those sorts of things, maybe, I compare myself to Steve Jobs, let's say, and it's like, well, there was a pretty big delta between just the different, where he lived, where he grew up, the contacts he had, the opportunities that were open to him, and how far along he was in his professional career. So, I think that's kind of the big thing is we need to recognize we shouldn't be doing it as much, um, and maybe recognize when we are doing it so that we can kind of raise a red flag. Um, but I mean,
Yeah,
yeah,
I think that makes a lot of sense. And you know what, like you hear this a lot, right, with business owners or leaders where they will you know, pedestalize a given individual, right? So let's take Steve Jobs, for example, you know, as somebody that you just mentioned. Um, you know, one of the things that we often forget too is that you could take all the good of Steve Jobs, right? He is a visionary. He, you know, founder of Apple. He made a gajillion dollars, right? Created the iPhone for all intents and purposes, all these cool innovations. And that's great. But also, I think we forget the context, not just of like his upbringing, right? The cabinet maker. We've all heard the cabinet maker story of making the inside of the cabinets or the back of the cabinets beautiful. But we also forget that, like, what about his personal life, right? What about his relationship with his spouse, with his children, with his parents? Because oftentimes when we're talking about these comparison things, we look at the highlight reel and we don't look at the whole picture. And I think, you know, if you want to have Steve Jobs impact, you also have to have Steve Jobs baggage, right? And not to just, you know, rag on Steve Jobs. I think that this applies to any individual and to firms too, right? You know, if we think about just, you know, pretty popular things in the software space, right? Facebook was famous for their move fast and break stuff saying, right? And eventually they added something to the tune of like, while maintaining stability, or something to that effect. And I think it brings up a really interesting piece about startups or small companies or companies in various industries where innovation is a feature, not a bug, right? It's something that we absolutely need, and stability is less worthwhile. But if you're working in healthcare care or financial technology or in some space where stability is the key thing, right? Government, for example, move fast and break stuff is the antithesis of what you need to be doing. And you also see, as all these companies start to mature, innovation slowing down, we treat it like it's a bug of maturity and of size, but it's actually a necessity to have maturity and size, right? Your customer base wants predictability. They want to know that your new release is going to feel like the old release because they don't want to have to learn a whole new system every time, right? So I think that context is really critical for us to think about when we get into those comparison traps.
yeah. Well, yeah, and I think that's when we think about what people view as the best. So uh, let's do a comparison against Amazon, for example. Amazon is doing hundreds, if not thousands, maybe multiple thousands of deployments a day, and those are including live deployments to production that are impacting customers immediately. And they're making, at least from what I've heard, they're making minor changes to the website all of the time, or you might get a certain version and I'm getting a slightly different version. And they're optimizing things all of the time, and that is cool to a lot of people. They think, oh, I want to have deployment on demand and release on demand and those kind of things. But not all features are hidden like that. Not all improvements are like minor things that you want to just roll out without people knowing about them or doing a fanfare. And if I'm you
And
know,
that's also
healthcare,
happening in the context of an e-commerce app, right?
yeah,
And those changes, they might improve the user experience or they might improve the bottom line, but they're really incremental, right? So like, yeah, Ed, you might have a slightly different, or a quote unquote different Amazon landing page than me because you're getting test A and I'm getting test B, but we're probably going to need to look real hard to figure out what that change is, right? So you want to make sure that we don't over glorify the breadth of the changes that we're talking about in these sorts of things, right? When you're doing hundreds or thousands of releases a day, we're talking about moving pixels, not moving mountains.
yeah. Well, and that's on the customer facing stuff, and then behind the scenes, they have lots of small things that are happening. But to the point you kind of made earlier is that if Google goes down, it's bad for them and it loses them money. It might be bad for advertisers. There might be, small repercussions or impact in the grand scheme of things. But if it is a healthcare company and their systems go down, that could mean lives at stake. Um,
Mhm.
if it's an energy company and they go down, that could again mean uh, lives again because of all the things that electricity is taking care of or helping out with. So uh,
And
it
and
doesn't
even in
make
the
sense.
context of Amazon too, right? The difference between, you know, Ed's widget resale page on Amazon going down or part of AWS going down are orders of magnitude different, right? If AWS crashes, half of the internet stops working, right? Right, so even within their individual context, right, there's just wide variation, and I think it's important for people to understand that, right? And the different risks, and how they build policies and how these organizations work around those risks and where they're willing to move fast and break things and where they're very much not
Yeah.
and why they're very much not.
I guess we've been calling these things like the best, and we're putting them in air quotes as we're saying it, but it's not really the best because what's the best for one company or one context or one area is not necessarily the best for the other. And so it's important to know what's best for you, what's best for your context, your growth plan, your strategy, your biggest concerns or issues or highest priorities, and have that influence things. And just now we've mostly been talking about infrastructure type things and like DevOps
Hmm.
practices and those kind of things. But also I think the related side of that is I feel like there's a lot of people who talk about hiring the best and they only want, somebody who's got a fang on their resume or whatever is going to be a big get for a lot of places, thinking that they're getting top talent and all of that kind of stuff. But again, that uh, I don't think that the top tier, top echelon, best engineers, best programmers, I don't think it makes sense to try to hire the, quote unquote best of the best in terms of those capabilities or skills at every company. Not every company can pay the top salaries. Not every company is offering interesting enough projects or enough freedom and autonomy. Because I mean, people who are that skilled and often are doing experiments or trying things that are off the beaten path. So they need to have flexibility. Or if they are trying to accomplish something really specific, they need clarity, which a lot of companies aren't able to provide their engineers today. So would they really be able to give a totally clear picture to this $1 million a year engineer that they chose to hire? Um, and a lot of companies don't even have the work environment that would be necessary to take someone like that who's a top performer at Google and did all these releases and then replicate that same success inside of their own company. So I don't know. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you think we've both been involved in hiring decisions and things like that or interviewing? Do you think it's worth chasing the quote unquote best?
Yeah,
Maybe
this
we
is
should
a
call it
sore
top
spot.
talent, right? I don't know.
Top talent, yeah, top talents. I mean, well, I think we should always be chasing top talent. But again, I think the key word here is always going to be context, right? It's top talent within your specific context. So, you know, when you look at, we can talk about FANG companies or, Fortune 200 or 250 or wherever you want to draw the line as, the places that top talent are most attracted to. And I
Maybe
think when
startups
you
in some
yeah,
cases.
startups too, very frequently, right? Because there's the asymmetric upside of startups, right? If you get in early and you build something that takes off, you have an asymmetric gain relative to the amount of work
A
that
lot
you
of
put in.
freedom and
A lot
flexibility,
of
not a lot of
freedom.
bureaucracy and
Yeah,
structure quite yet.
yeah, absolutely. And these are those skill sets. I don't want to say that they're mutually exclusive, but they're not necessarily the same skill set too, right? So the person who can become a distinguished engineer at Google is not necessarily going to be the person who's going to thrive in your 7-person startup, right? Or in insert any other organization here. So I think you have to understand what your context is and hire within the boundaries of that context. And I'm not going to advocate for, not looking at candidates with FANG on their resume. You're going to get people who are really good at working in those sorts of organizations, right? I think if you were to look at your peers, for example, Ed, I know I've seen this across mine, and you look at their LinkedIn profiles, you will see a career that usually centers within a certain band of types of companies, right? I remember when we were working together, one of the directors said that, yeah, he excels at growing companies from like 100 to like $250 million in revenue, or something to that line. And once they get beyond that, that sort of becomes out of his depth. And then he goes and he finds a smaller company and he helps build that company. And I think you see this again and again and again, where people like to do the things that they're relatively familiar with, the places that they've been successful in. And I think that you need to take that into consideration. And also, when we're talking about these folks, right? You alluded to like the proverbial seven-figure distinguished engineer salary. You also need to understand what you're going to be able to get with your budget at the organization that you work at, right? And you might be able to compress two roles into one role, and hire some great rock star engineer or leader or whatever. But you also need to think, is this individual going to be able to actually have the impact, like an impact that is greater than two people of perhaps lesser skill? Or are you just kind of, oh, we got someone from insert cool company here, right? I don't know. I think I'm maybe talking around in circles a little bit, but I think it comes down to context, and putting the best into context, right? Are you looking for the best person, period? You better be willing to pay the best person's salary. Or are you looking for the best person at a given price point, right? Are you looking for the best value? And I think that those are the questions that you really need to be asking when you're looking at these sorts of things.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and I think hiring for fit, I mean, even something as small as, well, how soon do you need to hire? Are you willing to wait forever to find the perfect unicorn candidate who is the best at everything? Or do you need to hire somebody sooner because you've got work to do and somebody else may not be able to do 150% of the work, but somebody else is certainly capable of the job. So let's get them in there. And um, I mean, I fundamentally agree. Like it is great to get people who work well and fit and perform, but also are the right one for that organization. And I think it's just that thing about individuals aren't achieving great things alone. It's the teams that do it. So even bringing in an elite, in quotes, a quote unquote elite individual, doesn't mean they're going to be able to perform if they're not part of the team or if it's not elevating the team as a whole. So um, yeah, I mean, I think that's the big thing. Is in my experience, it's always been about finding kind of that player who's going to help elevate the rest of the team. Their contributions are going to make a difference, and um, and it empowers the team as a whole. Kind of that idea of instead of 1+1 = 2, it's like 1+1 equals 3. Or they talk about it with
Mhm.
the plow horses or whatever, where they'll have these competitions and one horse can pull, something like 600 pounds or whatever. And so you'd think two horses, 1,200 pounds, but no, two horses can pull almost 3,000 pounds together, sort of a thing. Um,
Yeah.
so I think that sometimes we think too much about the rock stars because we're comparing against the people who are the best of the best, or the ones who are, publishing papers or out there at conferences and things like that. And I don't think the rock stars are usually the best employees at most companies, or in most cases, it's the people who contribute and elevate all the rest of the people around them. So I don't. What do you think
Yeah.
about that? I think we've talked about this in sports contexts and in when we've been outside of here, and so I'm curious what you think. And have you seen this play out with teams you've played on or worked with?
Yeah. And I think it's a really good point, Ed. Um, you know, team fit is huge. And when you have when you have the rock stars, you've got to have the right supporting cast, right? Freddie Mercury is not Freddie Mercury if Queen isn't behind him, right? Freddie Mercury tried to do some solo work. None of that lasted, but all of Queen lasted, right? Because there's chemistry. You need the right amount of pushback. You need the right amount of supporting cast in order for those types of folks to be successful, right? We should be trying to build teams that are greater than the sum of their parts, and just because somebody's great in one context does not mean that they're going to be great in another, right? We see this play out in sports all the time, right? Somebody was fantastic with the team, they got traded, and now their stats are garbage. Or somebody's play is in decline, and then they get traded and they are renewed with a new team. And it's because, the people around you make a difference. They make a difference in the opportunities. They make a difference in the way that we think and what we do, and that can't be overstated. And the other thing too is when we're talking about team composition, one of my like least favorite phrases is the like, oh, we only hire A players here, right? Which is, yeah, tantamount to saying I want to build a team of Michael Jordans. First off, realistically, you can't afford to build a team of Michael Jordans because nobody can, salary caps notwithstanding. And the other part is that Michael Jordan is only Michael Jordan because of the other people he played with, right? If you get rid of Rodman, if you get rid of Pippen, if you get rid of the extent of my basketball knowledge, which stops here, um, you don't have that same player. Like, would he still be an all-star? Sure. But would he win all those championships as well? I don't think so, right? We've seen this happen, sticking on basketball. We've seen it happen with LeBron, right? He's successful with some teams, but not as successful with others. One individual can't carry you to the promised land. It's about overall team composition that's going to get you there.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. So I think we've kind of talked a lot about why we what the problems are with comparison and why we shouldn't really be doing it. So I think we should probably talk about what we should be doing instead. And when I say we, that's us as individuals comparing against other people as leaders, and then even as companies and organizations. And I
Mhm.
would say for me, the main thing is that we should just shift our focus and our mindset, and we should shift it from being the best or hiring the best or comparing against the best, and instead we should focus more on how are we being better in meaningful ways. So instead of like how do we compare to Google in terms of deployment frequency or whatever, maybe we should be asking what are our actual problems and what can we do to solve them. And maybe deployment frequency is one of them, and we can take some lessons from Google that might help us, or Amazon, or whoever else. Um, but instead of making it the oh we need to like the Google does it this way, we need to do it this way too. That's our problem. How about we go the other direction and start with understanding our problems, and then go from there. So I don't know, what do you think about? We'll look at the hiring piece that we talked about in a second too. But what do you think about how we can shift the focus in terms of comparison against like the big companies or the top performing companies?
Yeah, I think you're spot on, right? I think we should remain focused on our problems and how we are solving problems for our customers. When you're focused on whether it's the best or competition, you're usually not serving your customers, right? Who are, the only folks who can, fire the entire company. Um, there was a story about somebody telling Steve Jobs, who we've, talked about a little bit here, showing him the Zune and saying, the Zune can do all these, different whiz bang things. And Steve Jobs, they asked him about it, and I think he said something to the extent of like, yeah, it might be a better product. We're not thinking about the Zune. We're thinking about the iPod and how we can make it better and how we can get it into more people's hands, right? Because he was focused on his customer base and on his business, not on what his competitors were doing, and not in getting into an arms race for the sake of getting into an arms race. He was, focused on what's going to solve problems for his end user base. I think that's what we really need to be to be focusing on, generally speaking. And that might be looking at competitors or looking at, North Stars, but it's usually not going to be how they actually do things that's going to be the most valuable, but probably how they think about things, how they go about problem solving, what systems and frameworks and mechanisms they use to come up with the right solution, because their solution is not going to be the right solution for you more times than not.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think we already kind of talked about this quite a bit. But instead of hiring, I would say instead of hiring the best on paper, or because of the roles they've had in the past or whatever, I think that the shift should be just look for people who fit the unique challenges of your organization, who fit your culture, who are going to be able to contribute in meaningful ways. And instead of it being about the individual successes, like, oh, look how cool it is, we hired this person from the ex Googler or whatever, uh, build a system where teams can thrive. And if we can shift
Hmm.
that focus more onto the success of the team as a whole, then we'll be looking for more team players, and that'll elevate everybody, which ultimately I think will just raise the level across the entire organization, and it'll lead to greater success, especially when those people are more aligned with the mission or long term objectives that the organization has. Anything else
Yeah.
you want to add that we might have missed earlier about the hiring piece?
No, and I think you've covered it, right? I think it's, you know, you've got to add to the best, right? It's the best in the context of what we're trying to accomplish. And that context is your culture, right? Your team fit, your budget, right? You can't just be, I think it's too easy to just like try to gold plate or try to like only shoot for the stars instead of shooting for what you actually need overall. And I think that if you're thinking about what your genuine needs are, and what you can genuinely afford, you're going to have a way better time.
Yeah. But I think even we can do a quick exercise ourselves pretty easily to see how there's no such one thing as the best. If you think about, say, the best boss that you ever had, uh, but if you took that same boss and all their same behaviors and maybe shifted it to your most recent job or your next job, they might not have been a good boss at all in those contexts. So um,
Hmm.
it's kind of easy to see there's lots of opportunities uh, to create the best when you have the environment for it. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I think we pretty much covered everything. Is there anything else you want to cover about comparison before we close out today?
Um, no, I think we've covered a lot of ground. Yeah, I think the TLDR is right. Comparison's a slippery slope, and it can be helpful to have direction and to have a North Star, but it's not going to serve you very well to compare and then chase whatever that comparison is without thinking deeply about why it exists and how it's relevant to your exacting situation.
Yeah, awesome. I think that's a great place to close it out today. So, today we've talked about the comparison trap, how it affects individuals, companies, and leadership. We've looked at why chasing the best isn't always the best strategy, and how focusing on what actually works for your team and your goals is far more valuable. As you reflect on this, ask yourself, where am I comparing myself or my company in a way that's actually unhelpful? What would happen if, instead of comparing, I focused on improving within my own context? Thanks for joining Leadership Explored today. If you found value in this discussion, please subscribe and share it with your network. We release new episodes every other week on Tuesday. Join us next time, and until then, keep leading with purpose.